In the quiet, working-class neighborhoods of South Liverpool, a storm was gathering. It wasn't a storm of wind or rain, but one of fear, fueled by ambition and desperation. This is the story of a young man who rose through the ranks of that storm, a man named Barry Kelly. He grew up in Speke, a district where, for some, the path to respect and wealth didn't run through a classroom or a trade, but through the shadowy world of street gangs. By his mid-20s, Barry Kelly was no longer just a local lad. He was deeply enmeshed with the Eastside Boys, a formidable organized crime group run by two brothers, Jake and Callum Burrows. He wasn't merely a dealer on a street corner. He had proven his worth, his nerve, and his loyalty, becoming a trusted lieutenant in the gang's complex hierarchy. In the cold language of court documents, prosecutors would later call him a crucial link connecting all the gang's illicit enterprises, from trafficking Class A drugs to dealing in dangerous firearms. He had his hands in everything, a multitasker in a world where mistakes were paid for dearly. His rise was built on a foundation of heroin and crack cocaine, moving the substances that ravaged his own community. It was also built on sourcing guns, overseeing deals, and ensuring the Eastside Boys were always ready for a fight. What does it take for a young person to make such a choice? Is it the lure of easy money, a search for belonging, or the simple, stark lack of other opportunities? These are questions with no easy answers. Kelly's ascent took place during a period of intense violence on the streets of South Liverpool. The Eastside Boys were locked in a bitter struggle for dominance, determined to control the drug trade in Speke. They sought to rule through sheer terror, and for a time, they succeeded. In a harrowing stretch of just 14 months between 2016 and 2017, the community was rocked by 10 different shootings linked directly to these turf disputes. The violence was not contained. 13 people were injured in the crossfire, a chilling number that included an innocent toddler caught in a spray of bullets that was never meant for them. Imagine the feeling in that tight-knit community, where the sound of gunfire became a terrifyingly normal part of life. Amid this chaos, Barry Kelly proved his allegiance. He helped the gangs smuggle their drugs and, just as importantly, stockpile their weapons, feeding the arsenal for the ongoing feud. Each weapon he moved, each deal he brokered, solidified his position. The gang's collection of firearms read like an inventory for a small army. A vintage St. Etienne revolver, a powerful Tikka hunting rifle, and multiple Smith & Wesson revolvers. They even had sawed-off shotguns. In a clever, almost rustic move to hide them from police, they would bury some of these weapons in local woodlands, a grim treasure hidden beneath the feet of unsuspecting dog walkers and playing children. It was an arms race playing out in the back alleys and housing estates of Liverpool. And Kelly played a pivotal part. He acted as a gun runner, ferrying the illicit weapons between suppliers and the gang's stash houses. He even helped connect his crew with a notorious bomb maker named Christopher Wallace, a man who could provide not just firearms, but homemade pipe bombs. The goal was simple: to outgun their rivals and secure their territory through overwhelming force. But guns were only half the equation. Drugs were the lifeblood of the operation. The Eastside Boys were deeply involved in the trafficking of heroin and crack cocaine, which were sold on street corners by a network of dealers. To manage their inventory, the gang relied on stash houses, often taking over the homes of vulnerable people in a brutal practice known as cuckooing. This tactic, where criminals co-opt a person's home for their own use, is a particularly cruel aspect of modern gang life. What does it say about a society when its most vulnerable citizens can be so easily targeted and exploited? Scholars and criminologists continue to debate whether this points to a failure of social support systems or a new, more predatory form of organized crime that preys on the weak. One of the gang's main hubs was a family home on Eastern Avenue, owned by a member named Lee Price. He had turned his house into a drug den, a place where runners would collect their supplies and drop off cash. Naturally, this made it a prime target. In a brazen act of intimidation, rivals performed a drive-by shooting on the house, sending bullets ripping through the walls and terrorizing the neighborhood once more. To stay ahead of the law, the gang was nimble. They used unlicensed scrambler bikes to navigate the maze-like estates and alleyways, knowing police cars couldn't follow. They communicated with cheap, disposable burner phones and coded messages, trying to keep their operations in the shadows. But the trail of violence was too glaring to ignore. Every shooting, every weapon found, and every life lost to an overdose only increased the urgency of the police investigation that was quietly, methodically closing in. The empire the Eastside Boys had built through fear was beginning to show cracks, and the world Barry Kelly had fought so hard to build was about to come crashing down. If this story resonates with you, feel free to share your thoughts below. Every empire built on fear has a lifespan. The constant violence and the terror inflicted upon the people of Speak could not go unanswered forever. While the Eastside Boys grew bolder, the Merseyside police were quietly mounting one of the most significant law enforcement efforts the area had ever seen. It was called Operation Bombay, a long-term covert mission with a single goal: to dismantle the gang from the top down. The operation didn't begin with flashing lights and sirens. It started in the shadows, with months of painstaking surveillance. Undercover officers tracked the gang's every move, mapping out their hierarchy from the street-level dealers all the way up to the Burroughs brothers and their weapon suppliers. They watched the stash houses, noting the endless cycle of couriers with packages and enforcers with weapons. For a community that had lived in silence for too long, a turning point was reached. Frightened residents began to cooperate, providing anonymous tips about who was behind the mayhem. It was a courageous act in a place where being labeled an informant could be a death sentence. But their bravery began to pay off. In January 2018, police made a bold move. They raided the drug den on Eastern Avenue, not just clearing it out, but physically boarding it up to send an unmistakable message to the gang. One of their primary hubs was gone. But the police weren't done. In a fascinating display of psychological tactics, they organized a massive convoy of police cars and armed units to parade through Speak at night. It was a show of force aimed squarely at rattling the gang's confidence, a declaration that the streets no longer belonged to them. Behind the scenes, the web of evidence grew tighter. Fingerprints on firearms, DNA on bullet casings, and phone records meticulously linked Barry Kelly's crew to the bomb maker, Christopher Wallace. Every piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of the Eastside Boys' reign. Finally, in the early hours of a morning in May 2019, the operation reached its explosive climax. Dramatic dawn raids swept across Merseyside. Teams of officers used battering rams and stun grenades to force their way into multiple homes simultaneously. Barry Kelly was caught completely off guard, arrested in the swift, coordinated strike. The Burroughs brothers were taken into custody, as was Lee Price and dozens of others. Over in another town, the bomb maker Christopher Wallace was captured in his home, where police found pipe bombs in his garage. devices that prosecutors said could have caused immense harm to innocent people. The raids yielded a trove of evidence: loaded handguns, a sawed-off shotgun, and huge quantities of heroin, cocaine, and cash. After 2 years of relentless work, Operation Bombay had delivered a decisive blow. The key players were in handcuffs, and their deadly feud was over. The court case that followed was staggering in its scale. 22 conspirators, including Barry Kelly, stood before the Liverpool Crown Court to face justice. The prosecution laid bare the gang's entire operation, from drug running to stockpiling weapons for a street war. Faced with a mountain of undeniable evidence, many, including Kelly, pleaded guilty. The sentences handed down were a clear signal of the severity of their crimes, totaling over 300 years of prison time for the entire network. Christopher Wallace, the bomb maker, received a life sentence. The gang leaders, Jake and Callum Burrows, were given 25 and 20 years, respectively. And then it was Barry Kelly's turn. At 26 years old, he stood in the dock as the court detailed his role as a trusted, versatile operative for the gang. He admitted to conspiracies to supply drugs, 3 firearms offenses, and even a plot to smuggle contraband into a prison. For his part in the chaos, the judge sentenced him to 18 years behind bars. With the gang dismantled, a fragile peace returned to speak. In the 600 days that followed the conclusion of Operation Bombay, reports of serious violence dropped dramatically. For the first time in years, there were 0 gun discharges reported in the community. But the story doesn't end there. Barry Kelly began his long sentence, eventually being transferred to HMP Kirklington Grange, a resettlement prison in North Yorkshire. Then, on May 25th, 2025, the story took its final, grim turn. At just 32 years old, Barry Kelly passed away while in custody. The official cause of death was not immediately released, and as is standard procedure, the prison service announced an investigation. But in the world that Kelly had inhabited, official statements rarely tell the whole story. His sudden end has raised a storm of unsettling questions. Could his death have been the result of a long shadow cast by his gangland past? Was it retaliation from a rival, or perhaps a former ally with a score to settle? Such questions linger, and the lack of a clear public explanation has fueled speculation. This is the unresolved debate of Barry Kelly's life. Did his story end with a quiet, tragic passing? Or was it the final, violent echo of the life he chose? Without a conclusive answer, we are left to wonder about the long reach of justice, both the kind served in a courtroom and the kind enforced in the shadows. The story of Barry Kelly is a stark reminder of the true cost of the criminal underworld. It's a world that promises wealth and power, but so often delivers only tragedy. His rise from the streets of Speak to a key figure in a feared gang was rapid, and his fall was just as swift. Operation Bombay stands as a testament to the power of determined police work and community courage, an operation that successfully reclaimed a neighborhood from the grip of fear. The peace it brought was real and deeply needed. Yet, the unanswered questions surrounding Kelly's final moments highlight a somber truth. The consequences of such a life do not end when the prison gates close. Vendettas, secrets, and loyalties can follow a person long after they've been removed from the streets. In the end, Barry Kelly paid the ultimate price for his choices, leaving behind a legacy of what might have been, and a community forever scarred by the violence he helped create. It forces us to ask, what does it truly take to break these cycles? And can a community ever fully heal from such deep wounds?